shot Dodson in the head, killing him instantly, and hit Taylor in the abdomen. Taylor staggered back down the hill and out of sight before collapsing. A bullet also pierced Clay Renfro in the side, and he and Jim Curley evacuated the open hillside. According to Bruce, the shooting ceased for a few seconds, and he prepared to make a run for it. But Bruce then noticed another man, S.B. Lawrence, lying beneath some bushes, his muzzle aimed straight at him. Bruce quickly wheeled his rifle around and shot, just as Lawrence blasted toward him. The posseman missed Bruce, but the moonshiner's bullet tore most of Lawrence's left arm from his body. Lawrence retreated down the hill to where fellow posseman E.P. Schoolcraft sat nursing the dying Taylor. Schoolcraft helped Lawrence remove his jacket to assess what was left of his mangled arm, and after Taylor took his last breath, they and the other two possemen scurried through the woods to a nearby farmhouse to report the incident and call for medical attention. Soon after the possemen reported the shooting, local lawmen arrived to take their statements, and a doctor arrived to amputate Lawrence's maimed arm. News of the deadly affair spread like wildfire through the surrounding areas, and local and federal lawmen, as well as dozens of concerned citizens and curious onlookers, flocked to the scene where the bodies of Taylor and Dodson were carried away. Enraged friends and members of the Taylor and Dodson families also made their way to the scene, vowing to avenge the deaths. A letter written by a citizen of Marshall to Little Rock's Arkansas Gazette the next day explained that some Searcy Countyans were, quote, in a high fever of excitement, and in case the guilty parties are captured, Judge Lynch will probably take a hand. Marshall's postmaster, M.A. Sanders, echoed such predictions, writing to the U.S. Marshal's office that, quote, all good citizens here are turning out to assist the officers to catch the murderers, and if, under the present excitement, any of them are caught, my opinion is they will be hung without ceremony. After the shooting, Bruce had hurried 10 miles east to his Van Buren County farm and stopped by his house just long enough to clean the bullet wound in his leg, shave his burly beard, and grab some food before heading deep into the wooded mountains to hide out. A few days later, Bruce went south through the Arkansas River Valley to Little Rock and then went east of the Mississippi River. He stayed in Alabama for the next 10 months, where he lived with and worked for a man named Sol Long. From there, he secretly corresponded with his wife and children and sent them money through his trusted brother-in-law who lived in the Indian Territory. It did not take long for the feds to finger Bruce as one of the key suspects, and Deputy Revenue J.P. King, who had diligently searched for the stubborn moonshiner since his and Burris's close encounter with him several weeks earlier, led a party of officers back to the Bruce farm a few days after the shooting. Though they failed to find Bruce, King finally located and destroyed the moonshiner's distilling equipment. King convinced Bruce's wife to show them her husband's still and promised to pay her the government's $10 reward. The revenuer also probably threatened her with charges for criminal accessory in the murder case if she did not. According to the later testimony of Harv Bruce, however, King did not keep his promise to pay his wife the bounty. During the trial, Bruce denounced King for such deceit, telling the court that if the federal officer was, quote, was a gentleman, he would pay it. Bruce seems to have been particularly bitter toward King, who he likely felt had unfairly used his elite status in the region to acquire federal authority for exploiting hard-working backcountry families like his. I'm going to skip on over here to the trial. Bruce was eventually caught. He slipped home in one of his brief visits back home from Alabama. His neighbor saw him and said he watched him all afternoon working around his farm, but he always had his Winchester with him, and he ended up having to wait until he went in his home at night and saw him. He set the gun down at the corner of the door there and busted in and caught him then, and of course turned him over to authorities. And then he was first sent to, well, he was convicted for for the federal crime of moonshining, so they sent him to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, federal pen there. So they had to go through the process of getting him back to Russellville to stand trial for the murder charges and all that. So, all right. Observers both locally and throughout the state eagerly anticipated the high-profile murder trial, now set to begin during the court's fall term in 1899. State Attorney Lawrence Russell, U.S. Attorney C.C. Waters, and Taylor family attorney J.T. Bullock headed the prosecution, while Colonel G.W. Bruce, perhaps a relative of Harv Bruce, and of Conway and J.A. Gillett of Atkins, prepared the defense. Interestingly, Davis and Son of Russellville, the private law firm of the state attorney general and soon-to-be governor, Jeff Davis, also assisted with Bruce's and the other moonshiners' defense. The Tribune of the Haybiners himself, though, was busy at the moment using his public office to file antitrust suits against every fire insurance company doing business in the state, much as Jesus Christ whipped out such a gang of fellows out of the temple, as Davis described it. After the fall term finally opened and the Pope County Circuit Court disposed of its less dramatic cases, Judge William L. Moose commenced the trial and proceeded carefully with jury selection in early November. No case that has been tried here for many years has attracted the attention of this one, Russellville's Courier-Democrat noted. And it and other area newspapers, reflecting the unusual interest in the case, reported on the thrilling evidence unearthed during the trial by the examination of nearly 100 witnesses. The most dramatic point of the trial, of course, came when Harve Bruce himself took the stand. Although Bruce came to court clean-shaven, which likely disappointed a number of urban reporters hungry for a picture-perfect mountain drama, Little Rock's Arkansas Gazette described the now infamous moonshiner as, quote, a typical mountaineer in build and character, being strong, athletic, and said to be absolutely fearless, and as an unerring marksman. Standing 6'2" and weighing about 190 pounds, the gray-headed 55-year-old Bruce, who was said to have been known for his quick-spokenness, calmly took the stand. Never flinching as the prosecutors grilled him with tough questions and accusations, Bruce stood ready with direct responses, his pale blue eyes staring straight into theirs without any appearance of nervousness or intimidation. Admitting that he had been manufacturing illegal whiskey and eluding authorities when the deadly shootout occurred, Bruce took full blame for doing all the shooting at Taylor, Dodson, and the other officers at the still that day, but he insisted that he did so only in self-defense. When asked by the prosecutors why he fired at the officers, Bruce candidly responded, "I shot to hurt, for I saw no other reason to save no other way to save my life." He explained that Taylor and his men never properly identified themselves as lawmen and that they shot first. After hearing closing arguments and receiving instructions from Judge Moose on November the 17th, the jury deliberated for 5 days. Much to the disappointment of the prosecutors, the Taylor and Dodson families, and others who prayed for a first-degree murder conviction, the jury found Bruce guilty of involuntary manslaughter and set his sentence at 6 months in the state prison. Bruce's statements on the witness stand, explained the Courier-Democrat, made a strong impression on the jury. Nevertheless, the defense, to the surprise of many, proved unsatisfied with the verdict and appealed the decision to the Arkansas Supreme Court. On November the 23rd, the state Supreme Court notified Judge Moose that it had accepted Bruce's appeal and his bond was set at $4,000. The Russellville paper reported the case's new development in its Thanksgiving Day issue. As soon as the necessary papers were properly executed and delivered, this old man, accompanied by as true and loyal a wife as ever clung to a man in his hours of trial and tribulations, passed upon the streets, and having received the congratulations of many friends, entered a covered wagon and departed for his home amid the tall pines, stately oaks, and towering cliffs of the Boston Mountains, there no doubt to await with more or less anxiety the report of those who shall pass judgment as to what shall be the closing chapter of this most unfortunate and ever deplorable period of his life. Hoping that the Arkansas Supreme Court would overturn the ruling, Bruce and his family patiently waited for word from Little Rock, which they finally received in late June of 1900. Unfortunately for them, the state's high court affirmed the ruling. In writing the court's opinion, Justice J. Battle even went so far as to say that, quote, the verdict of the jury is remarkable. They were unreasonably lenient to him, and he has no right to complain. With his appeal for acquittal rejected, Bruce left for Little Rock to serve his 6-month prison term. Soon after his arrival, Superintendent Bud McConnell assigned Bruce to guard duty, purportedly telling him that since, quote, he could use a Winchester so dexterously on marshals, he would make a good guard. Luckily for Bruce, however, he had made some important connections that shortened his stay at the state prison. The owner of the Russellville law firm that had helped defend him at his trial in Pope County now occupied the state's chief executive office, and Governor Jeff Davis included Bruce when he issued an unprecedented number of pardons after his inauguration in January 1901. A Karl Marx for the hillbillies, the Arkansas-born sociologist Rupert Vance characterized him, Davis later defended his controversial pardoning record against critics in typical populist fashion, arguing that at least he had, quote, pardoned the people, while the conservative state Supreme Court's Judge Wood pardoned the railroads. Not long after he arrived in Little Rock to serve his time in prison, Bruce, now one of the most noted characters in the penitentiary, received a visit from a reporter for the Conway Democrat, who depicted Bruce as, quote, a typical old mountaineer and moonshine distiller who had once wore long, flowing whiskers, which made him look about as we imagined Moses did about the time he delivered the law of the children of Israel. Assessing Bruce's resistance through the lens of typical hillbilly stereotypes, the reporter claimed that, quote, the mountaineer hates the marshals and the government that try to prevent him from doing with his corn as he pleases. He thinks he has as much right to make whiskey out of it as bread, he continued. Bruce's own explanation, however, pointed to more practical economics in the rural Ozarks rather than some anti-government culture and knee-jerk reaction against the feds telling him what he could and could not do. When asked by the reporter why he and his Ozarks neighbors had flouted anti-moonshiner regulations, Bruce explained that their corn was worth only 30 cents per bushel, but when they made it into whiskey, the slop was worth as much as the corn to feed the hogs, and they could get $2 per gallon for the whiskey. This was the only way, Bruce explained, of getting any money up there in the mountains, wrote the reporter. It was his and his family's best chance of fulfilling the American dream in the increasingly opportunity-strapped rural Ozarks. Nevertheless, because of the unfortunate ruckus that had left 2 men dead and landed him the slammer, Bruce promised that he would not distill any more whiskey, as he wanted to live in peace now. After leaving the state prison, Bruce returned home to Oak Mountain, where he lived the life of a respected and honored citizen until he died a few years later in March of 1907. Pretty interesting. In fact, True West magazine picked this up and published a little article on it, I think in 2015, I noticed, as I was working on this actually, it came out in True West. Any questions about that or the book? General, the themes, other content? Yes.
Was moonshining the only thing that the only thing, or were there other kinds of in your book? Do you cover other kinds of situations?
You talking about kind of resistance?
Resistance, yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah. That's just one chapter.
That's just one.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So I've got a chapter in there on actually kind of surprised me quite a bit of resistance to the draft.
Okay.
Military draft during World War I, and several cases of even armed resistance to the draft. There's another chapter on resistance, some small farmers resisting some USDA programs, especially a law passed in 1906 that required cattle farmers to go dip their cattle to try to get rid of ticks. And then I take it on into 1930s and look at kind of attitudes toward the New Deal a little bit, and also probably one of the biggest things as far as funding goes that came out of that for Arkansas, the Ozarks, was the dams and lakes, Lake North Fork, Bull Shoals, and all that. So, and then I take it on even into the 60s and 70s as well, war on poverty, things like that.
You might mention your introduction with the Smithville.
Yeah. Several of you. That's what I start out with in the introduction is the was that 1983, the shootout between Lawrence County Sheriff and Gordon Call. Tax protester actually spoke to the Rotary Club in Pocahontas here earlier this summer. I read that to them. Some of you may remember that. I don't. I wasn't born yet. It's actually my mother and father's wedding day. They tell stories about getting caught up in the roadblock.
Wow. That all happened right down the road from where my ex-mother-in-law lived.
Is that right? Yeah. In Smithville is where it happened. That's where I'm from.
Yes, you did. Resistance in World War I. Didn't poor Arkansans see that as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight?
Yeah, many of them did.
that terminology in the book.
Yeah, that was a common view of the war, and I would argue that even as we moved into April 1917, when the U.S. declared war, probably most rural people were not supportive. But once the United States declared war, most decided to support the troops and that kind of thing. But there were some who were dedicated to continue their resistance, and even so much as, in some cases, violently.
My question goes back to the bootlegging story. So I don't know, is it a timeline question? I don't know. But, so like the Hot Springs area where bootlegging was very widely accepted, they had water bottling companies that were actually, actually selling, filled with liquor, things like that. And, so this story that you talk about here, how does that fall in the timeline? Is like maybe the more northern counties, were they overreacting to the liberal aspect of it down around Hot Springs, or I don't know? What?
Yeah, I don't know. When I think of, I don't know that much about Hot Springs, its history, some, but I think more 1920s, national prohibition. So this, we don't have national prohibition yet when this happens. They're getting in trouble because they're breaking revenue laws and so forth. But I think there are some similarities to that. I mean, one of the things I found as I looked into this, again, the kind of typical hillbilly stereotypes. You think, well, these bunch of drunk mountaineers making it, and drinking it all up before they get the next batch made. But that's not what they were doing. In fact, I found some sources that commented that one of them, he was just surprised that none of them ever took a drink. I mean, they were doing this for business, and they were finding new markets as new railroad towns sprang up, new timber towns, and there's some mining going on in the Ozarks. And as these new towns came up, a lot of young men coming in from off to work. I mean, they finding new markets. Bruce and them, I found some clues that they were probably doing some business with a wagon dealer down in Little Rock, so they were shipping it to Little Rock, possibly even out into Indian Territory in Oklahoma, soon to be Oklahoma, as Oklahoma began to develop new towns and so forth. Yeah.
Did all of the laws against moonshining have to do with the revenue?
Exactly.
All of the laws were related to money, that the government made were related to money?
Yeah, well, for the federal level, of course they were violating. I'm pretty sure up to that point, before statewide prohibition, well, it was similar to what we have today, kind of a local option, but at the township level. And so I charted that a little bit. There would be elections every couple of years. Each township would vote whether they wanted to allow a licensed distiller to operate in their township or not. And by that time, by the late 1890s, I'd say at least more than half of the local townships in the Arkansas Ozarks had voted no. They didn't want a licensed distiller. So if that was in place in this, and I think it was, if I remember right, in this township, they would have also been violating that, because they didn't have a license. That was the only legal way to distill, according to state law.
So were licenses, distilling licenses, were they hard to get?
I assume.
Or did they just didn't want to do it, or what was the?
Yeah, I don't really know how. I mean, the state.
In 1890s, Randolph County had 20-some odd legal distilleries here, and the rub comes from the revenuers, the IRS. These distillers that paid the revenue, that's why they were the revenuers. They were breaking. It was a federal law they were breaking. That's where the rub came. I mean, the state issued permits. I've got a list of those distilleries in Randolph County in the 1890s, early 1900s, until Carrie Nation kind of come along. It was pretty well accepted. You women didn't want whiskey, but you women.
I did.
Well, at that time, women wanted two things. They wanted the country to drop, go away, and they wanted the right to vote. They eventually got both with the
That.
constitutional amendments.
Right.
One which was overturned later, the other one should have, oh, that was all right, Robin. I almost got right, didn't I? Go ahead.
Mercy.
Yeah, they were legal, the revenue, the federal government wanted the revenue.
Yeah,
No,
sure.
no one in Randolph County has ever protested anything, but do any of the stories revolve around this area?
Randolph County
Yeah.
doesn't make, no, I didn't, most of what I talk about,
Found
even my home county, I left Lawrence out, most of it's more
So that's,
further west.
so that's a field that someone could research?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Alright, there you go. Put some stamps
Sharp,
on there.
there's some stuff on Sharp, some on Izzard, Stone, a lot on Searcy County, for some reason. They seemed to have pretty good records, so that's a lot of what I was doing, was kind of following the.
Probably won't find much in Randolph.
There's a lot.
For the record, keeping it was not good.
In my opinion, in the deep woods, there's lots of game and fish, so there's stuff to eat, no money, and not much of a way of getting money. Desperate times calls for desperate actions,
Yeah,
and this is about the only way they had of getting money.
yeah, and you know, this actually coincides with, at the same time where, a little bit later, in the 1910s, I guess it was, you know, the Game and Fish was created, Game and Fish Commission, and so they're starting to really enforce hunting and trapping regulations, and so a lot of those kinds of things are kind of piling up, I think, for a lot of these rural people, and they're beginning to feel like, well, they're after us, you know.
You know, in the 30s, if you were a stranger and you wanted to know where the good squeezins were, you went to the sheriff because he was probably one of the best customers.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a good book on Appalachia. I can't remember which county it is, in Western Virginia, not West Virginia, but Western Virginia. And yeah, this historian uncovered this huge local political whiskey ring. The prosecuting attorney was in on it, the sheriff. I mean, they were, it was a pretty sophisticated, it was the late 20s before Prohibition ended.
I can witness that. I grew up in western Oklahoma, and it become whiskey. They had 3-2 beer, but alcohol, whiskey become legal.
Yeah.
Package stores in '57. Up till then, if you was in the ring, it was bonded whiskey shipped in from Texas. So if you was in that ring, you didn't get arrested. They'd raid you once in a while, but they'd let you know it, and they'd haul the whiskey all down the creek. I'm running with a kid. His dad was a bootlegger. He was real old, and he'd come down. We didn't have phones. He'd come down and say, "Boys, I can't go tonight. I gotta help Dad take the whiskey out the creek." And so after they raid them, then they go back, and that's the way it went.
Yeah. It's not in the book. I didn't mention the book, but I was looking through, I think it was Governor Parnell's papers in the late 20s, and it was someone from the governor's office in Missouri was writing to Arkansas Governor Parnell, complaining that the local authorities, sheriff and so forth in Mammoth Spring were running, you know, of course they were concerned about Thayer across the state line there, so I never did follow that up to see, you know, what there was on that, but I remember coming across a few letters. Hey, Governor, you need to get there on that state line. And get your sheriff in line up there.
Spring water.
Yeah. Pure water.
My father-in-law always used to say that the fine folks of Randolph County wanted more revenue in this area, and every time they got something going on James Creek, the sheriff would show up and bust it up with an axe.
Oh, yeah.
Have you or anyone else looked at families of moonshiners? Because on a antidote, you know, just it was mere antidote, but my grandpa would always say that, you know, the moonshiners' families became growers of weed. And then their kids became, you know, operators of meth operations. I wonder if anyone's ever researched and looked at where those families, like...
Yeah?
No, I agree it's a stretch.
I'm not sure.
Copperhead Road.
Bruce's son went on to become a doctor.
Yeah.
That's all. I don't never follow him up. He does have some relatives still out there. I communicated with one of them down in Florida, I believe he is. And, he sent me some information. In fact, I believe he worked for the FBI. So, sounds like a pretty successful family in that case. I don't know.
Well, I think he does hit on a similarity between the two. So we're kind of laughing and giggling and maybe even romanticizing the bootlegging when meth is similar in that it's economics driven.
Yes,
a lot of it, the bootleggers were doing that for money because that was the only way they could make money or make good money. And meth manufacturers say they make better money at that than they can working in a factory. Yeah. You know, so that's a similarity, I think. And so that, you know, that's an economics factor that's is a large point in rural Arkansas.
Yeah. I definitely think this was mostly economics.
Yeah.
There's no saying the apple don't fall far from the tree. That's not always true, but in lots of cases it is.
But it was economics and freedom.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Not just economics.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Right. I mean, to Bruce, I mean, I think he, despite the dramatization, maybe that reporter that I quoted, I mean, he felt like he had the right to do that with his corn as just much as he had the right to load it up in a wagon and send it to a buyer somewhere else. He saw it as a part of his farming operation.
So, how do you explain that the counties that you're looking at today are the most conservative counties in Arkansas? How do you explain this populism then and conservatism now?
That's a good question, and a long one. In some ways, that's kind of what this book's about. Changes over time, because these people, and I talk about that here. Bruce, again, they were supporting people like Jeff Davis, who was very pro-government in so many ways, especially on economics. But how can I say that? How can I answer that question in short sentences? Well, read the book, but I think a big part of it is the collapse of the small farm economy, the rise of a mostly light industry, tourism, agribusiness kind of economy, especially by the 1960s and into the 70s. But so many, I mean, one of the stories that we often miss, and I think it's a huge one, you think about not just the Ozarks, but rural Arkansas, rural Alabama, or whatever, is this massive out-migration of rural people who left once they could no longer make it farming. And so, and then, in the case of the Ozarks especially, all you gotta do is drive up to Mountain Home and take a look, I mean, or go into the stores or anything, and you'll hear mostly, or I tend to, maybe I'm just looking for it, but a lot of Yankee accents. So that indicates
they're coming back.
You got what historian Brooks Blevins calls population replacement. New people coming in after all those natives left, and their land's pretty cheap. And many of them brought their politics with them. And there are other explanations there too, but I think that's a big part of it. But so economic change, demographic change, I think, is part of it. I mean, the culture wars in the 60s, that kind of thing.
Most of them people that moved down here to the north, though, had a paycheck coming in the mail every day.
Yeah, a lot of them were retirees. That's right.
They couldn't stay if they didn't.
Yeah.
And many of them had family ties here to begin with. They were maybe the grandchildren of the people who moved up north.
Sometimes.
A lot of them are coming back. Yeah.
Although I don't know that much about, Cherokee Village was a retirement community over there in Sharp County. And I don't know that much about, I can't remember the last time I've been to Cherokee Village, but my understanding is that it's kind of declining up there as a lot of these retirees have died, and they don't have children around, and so sometimes empty houses sitting around and things like that.
Where's Bruce buried at?
Hart Bruce? I'm not sure. He lived in Van Buren County. If I did come across that, I don't recall. Probably could find it on Find a Grave or something like that. I'll look for that or not. It's in the northwest corner of Van Buren County is where he's from. Way up in the mountains there.
So you think he's buried up there?
I would imagine somewhere in that, yeah, local cemetery in that area. I don't know that for sure.
What do you see as the 21st century's hot button for hell raising in Arkansas?
Good question. Good
Yeah.
question.
That's a good one. It seems to, whereas this was more, a lot of this stuff, I mean, a lot of the resistance, even the draft resistance, I mean, a lot of that was economics, you know. There's, I think, probably some of that today, but it seems like there's more cultural issues that are at play, you know, causing issues, as you say, some of the hell raising. So, I mean, economics is certainly there, I guess, but a lot of cultural battles, a lot of them stemming from the 60s and things like that get people riled up, it seems like. If my Facebook, you know, thing is any indication, that seems to be a lot of
Does the out-migration seem to have tapered off?
Well, I mean, I think overall, Rex Nelson has talked about this, written quite a bit about this. I mean, maybe overall, if you look at Arkansas as a whole, as a state, I think population seems to be growing a little bit, but what's sometimes hidden under that is that you've got these pockets, these growth centers that are just busting at the seams, and yet rural small town areas are continuing to drastically decline. Anything else? Other questions?
How much is your book?
25.
All right.
Can we gladly sign them for you?
Sure.
Hey, that's worth something. Yeah. Show that to my grandkids.
Well, I appreciate your attention. It's been fun. Thank you.
All right, and next week will be George Jarrett talking about his new book. Come back for that. And I'm sure he'll be happy to sell you a book.
Is this new book about, is it about the Dalton murder?
No, it's about Amanda Tussing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right, thank you guys.